We've been studying in Ecclesiastes, and we're learning this time that Solomon's going to tell us that life is not monotonous. Now, that's an interesting discovery by him, because I think if you read the first 3 chapters, which probably most of you have, you will find that one of his complaints was that life is monotonous. So which is it? And which is good and which is bad? Actually, they could probably both be both, and it probably is both, isn't it? Life is monotonous. Every day it snows, and then it snows some more. I'm convinced that the next purchase of an automobile will be a snow plow, is what we're going to get. So it's monotonous, isn't it? It just snows and snows and snows all the time. Okay, enough of that complaining. But it's also not monotonous in many different ways, because you never know what's coming next. You never know whether it's snow or ice or sleet or rain or sunshine. You just never know. And that's true in all the different ways of life. King Solomon, a few thousand years ago, on his own behalf, but thankful for you and I, decided he was going to conduct an experiment. This was an experiment that he was going to taste every single thing there was to taste in life. And he was the richest man in the world at the time. He was also the wisest man in the world, and in some ways, probably the most powerful man in the world as well. And he was going to do it all. He was going to try it all, and he was going to find out what is the meaning of life. You know, Satan uses a couple strongholds on us, 3 in particular. And it's been true back in the day of Solomon. It's true today. He uses power, he uses possessions, and he uses pleasures to do everything he can to keep us captive to the power of sin and evil and away from our trust in our great and mighty God. He went after them. Solomon would seek them with everything he had. All of his might went after power. All of his might went after possessions. And yeah, all of his might went after pleasure as well. Unfortunately, today, the vast majority of the population of this planet still has a preoccupation with those 3 features: power, possessions, and pleasures. But God has more for us. Solomon was beginning to draw conclusions from chapters 1 through 3 that life was monotonous and meaningless until you add God to the equation. Now in chapter 4, he takes up the argument again, but now he's going to look at specific circumstances of life, and he's going to find that there is some meaninglessness there, and often these things are just not fair. Some of these are the problems that come at us every single day. And we have no idea what's going to come, when it's going to come, or how it's going to come. Makes you think that probably Solomon had a little bit this in mind when he wrote the Proverbs. And he said, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." James wrote it a little bit differently. He said about, don't tell everybody that I'm going to go to a certain city and I'm going to do certain business and I'm going to do this tomorrow and then I'm going to do this the next day, because you really don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. Now, that doesn't mean, neither of them are saying, so just live haphazardly and don't plan your life. They're just saying, be aware that anything can happen at any time, and God can disrupt and interrupt your life whenever he wants to, however he would like to, whether it's good or bad, but it's not monotonous. When he does that, it does impact you. So we're going to take a look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and the first thing we're going to do is to look at how it's unfair in the courtroom. Now, here's a disclaimer, okay? I use a few tools for when I'm studying, and there's some that I throw in here and there, but basically for the book of Ecclesiastes, I have at least 3 commentaries that I've used all the time. I read them constantly and study from them. One is Warren Wiersbe's, one is Walter Kaiser's, and another one is Ray Stedman's. And I pick and choose and do things for this particular chapter. Bless you, Heidi. And for this particular chapter, I couldn't figure out any of them. It didn't make sense. I liked my outline, but I didn't have the words, so I stole the words that Wiersbe used, and I found I didn't even like the words he used. But anyhow, that's what I did. So he called it the courtroom. I wanted to use anything other than courtroom, but I couldn't come up with a word for it. Look at verses 1 through 3. It says, "Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun." There are people that will say to you, "You think God is a God of love, but how can a God of love allow such suffering to happen?" Okay, that's a legitimate question. He's already told us in chapter 3 that there's a time for everything, and we need the painful times as well as the pleasant times. Solomon could look all around him, and he would see, Wiersbe called it a courtroom, but he saw people who were oppressed, that they were being abused and put down by others. I was so glad when we sang that first chorus today that it talked about how God has rescued us who are oppressed. And it seems like the system preys on the helpless, the weak, the infirmed, those who cannot defend themselves, but God is their defender. And Solomon could see also that the system not only oppressed them, but had no interest in helping them whatsoever. So he made a couple observations. One was that oppression and exploitation, it was in the halls of justice. It was there. It was happening. He's the king of the land, and under his system, people are being oppressed, and those who are oppressing them are taking advantage of them. He noticed that pain and sorrow was in the lives of innocent people. They didn't do anything to deserve this, but it was happening to them anyhow. And he saw then a lack of concern from those who could have and should have brought comfort, but didn't. And did you see what he said in verses 2 and 3? Death would be preferable. Now, he's not the first one to ever come to that conclusion, because if you read Jonah chapter 4, you will see Jonah get into a debate with God over the gourd that grew up over him in the shade, and then all of a sudden it wilted, and Jonah wanted to die. He really wanted to die because God was saving, rescuing, forgiving, and pardoning the evil Ninevites that were just so despicable. We can't even speak about the things that they did. And Jonah didn't like it because those were their enemy number one. And he was not happy about that. And he thought it was better to die than to eyewitness and be part of you rescuing these evil people. In 1 Kings, or was that 2 Kings, chapter 11? No, it's 1 Kings, and it's chapter 19. But Elijah was saying, "I'd rather be dead. I am the only person in the world who has not bent the knee to Baal. There's no one out there who stands for God except for me, and they're about to come after me, and they're going to get me big time. I think I'd be better off dead than to be thrown in the hands of them." And God showed him that there were many, many others. But not even just the idea of, I wish I were dead. There were some that wished, and he suggested here in chapter 4, it would have been better never to have been born. Remember a guy named Job? In Job chapter 3, after he'd been attacked by Satan for no guilty reason of his own, God said, "This is the greatest man in all the earth." And Satan attacked him. God allowed him to touch him and to bring suffering on him. And Job said, "I would have been better had I never been born. God, just curse the day of my birthday. Don't let it ever come up again." Men can be so cruel and so inhuman, and I don't know what I'm doing to that, so I'm sorry, so bear with us. Can be so inhuman toward each other. In our culture, there's this concept of we have freedom, and there is freedom to obey, but in our culture, we also have freedom to disobey and to treat people in a wrong way. There's a couple things that Solomon wants us to remember. One thing would be that the final recompense lies ahead. God's going to bring everything to light. He's going to straighten it all out eventually. And then he also says, remember that even the injustices teach us something of great value. It shows us how wicked our hearts are. And it should be a warning to us as well. So we move on from there, and Solomon goes to the marketplace next in verses 4 through 8. It says, "And I saw that all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hands and ruins himself. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This, too, is meaningless, a miserable business." Solomon went to the marketplace and he observed people working day after day, all their normal activities. And you saw in verse 4, he talks about the industrious man. These, again, are Warren Wiersbe type words. This guy was busy, skillful, working with his hands, doing great things. But what about his heart? What was his motive? And Solomon told us he observed that this guy was working to get ahead of the Joneses. He was competing constantly, trying to beat out other people, getting stuff for the sake of getting stuff. The Bible warns us about covetousness. It goes along with that competition and envy. They all mix in together. Ambition becomes their driving point. You know people like this. Competition's not a bad thing. It's okay. But when it's out of control, it's not good. Verse 5 told us about the idle man. There was no ambition whatsoever in him. He was the opposite. Lazy. His laziness became comfortable, which in the end becomes self-destruction. Elsewhere, Solomon wrote in Proverbs chapter 6 that poverty sneaks in and comes like a bandit. So, want me to use a handheld maybe instead? I don't know. It's nobody's fault up there. It's just something's crackling. Must be the elephants on my tie. We'll see. Poverty sneaks in and comes at us like a bandit. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul says, "If anyone would not work, neither shall he eat." Some of you know that verse. It's not a good situation. Verse 6, he tells us, this is a word I didn't like, that I couldn't come up with another one, but Wiersbe, I used it. The integrated man. I wanted to use the balanced man because he's balanced, but it didn't begin with an I. Productive at work, and yet careful to take time for himself and others. He was not a part of the rat race. Paul wrote to Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain, and that's a good thing. Solomon's recommending basically moderation here. And 7 and 8 talks about the independent man, the hardworking guy, but he's all alone. He lives alone. He has nobody else family-wise, and yet he keeps pursuing more and more. But in no way does he have anyone to share with. And it brings sadness and isolation to him. He never asked, why am I robbing myself? There's a couple verses that Solomon wrote for us elsewhere. Better is little with the fear of the Lord. And he also told us that better is little with righteousness than great treasure and injustice. Moderation is what he's trying to tell us in our work. So Solomon looks at those situations there and he says there's no comforter, there's no rest, there's no companionship. All of this is meaningless, and he says it's miserable business. Miserable. Now, God's not against us laboring. He wants us to work. He put Adam in a garden and gave him instructions, and ever since then we were all supposed to work and do what we're called to do, but to labor in the right spirit and for the right reasons is what he wants us to do. So we come to verses 9 and 12, which will tell us about society. Two are better than one because they have good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up, but pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. This is the value of companionship. There's strength in numbers. Friendship is very, very important. There's a lot of value in people. Did you catch that he said that 2 are better than 1? Would you not agree? Okay, sorry to subject you to that, but when it comes to working, verse 9, 2 are better than 1. You get more done. It's more efficient. It's easier. You end up with better profits. Some of you may remember, and sing right along if you want, the song from the Great Depression that said, potatoes are cheaper, tomatoes are cheaper. Now is the time to fall in love. If everything's cheaper for you, then for 2 of you, sure, why not? It's better. It's better working. It's better walking in verse 10. Back in their day, and it's still true in some places around here, they had some rough roads. And it was not unusual for people to be walking and stumble and trip and fall. And you need physical help. We all need some help at some time. And we need that physical help. When you stumble and fall, someone be there to help you up. How much more do we need help spiritually when we stumble and we fall spiritually? Those issues are way, way bigger than just the physical fall and broken bone that we could get. Verse 11 talks about how 2 are better when it comes to warmth. If you're alone, you need an electric blanket or a sleeping bag, or my kids always loved the bricks in the oven that we wrap up. No, they didn't. But you know what? When you're traveling, it's hard to carry bricks and electric blankets and things when you're alone and going great distances. And in verse 12, 2 are better when it comes to safety and watchmen. It's better for defense. And in their culture, and it's still true most of them had to travel in groups. They did that for fellowship, but they also did it for safety. Remember, Jesus was left behind at the temple, and the caravan of relatives and friends and neighbors was traveling back, and all the kids were together, so no one suspected anything until bedtime that night. And where's Jesus? We left him in Jerusalem. We just thought he'd be with everybody because we all traveled together, and that was safe. 1 cord can be easily broken. 2 can be broken with a little bit more work, but 3 are extremely difficult, almost impossible. There's unity, there's friendship in numbers, and it's so very good. But with all the attributes and advantages of companionship, it can still leave us empty. It does not satisfy that sense of eternity that we have in our hearts, that longing for God that he placed there. So, verses 13 through 16 talk about the palace, the political stuff, the ruling. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to take warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. That's probably a little bit confusing, but it's basically pointing out 2 things. The instability of political power You rise up and you go down. And then the fickleness of the populace. The people are going to, they shout hello and cheers for you. Wilberforce said in England, when he was reminded how popular he was becoming, he said, yeah, but the same crowd that cheers me today will cheer if they hang me tomorrow. And that's probably true. Today's hero is tomorrow's bum. How can God take a system like that and incorporate that into his plans? Riches and position are no guarantee of a successful, happy life. And just like today, many people back then in high places were experiencing failures. We see it all the time. And just as sure as riches were not a guarantee, poverty is not necessarily a barrier for achievement. There's no excuses. Wisdom is the key. Here you go. Warren Wiersbe's going to tell us this. I like it. It is good to have the things that money can buy. It's really good to have those things, as long as you don't lose the things that money can't buy. Jesus said it a little bit different in Mark chapter 8 when he talked about the person who gains the entire world but loses his soul. It's a horrible thing to think of, but that's what Solomon was seeing. He was seeing the meaninglessness, the emptiness of people's lives. They were getting stuff and stuff and stuff, and they were not satisfied. They had no peace in their hearts. So Solomon took a deep look all around him, and he could see that life was pretty complex, and often it was unfair. He could find lots of trials, lots of problems. You and I do that too. But yet he really wasn't cynical about life. He wasn't saying, let's check out and it's no good. He continues and will continue to point us back to God, who is the one who's in control. God's the one who walks with you every single day. God is the one who blesses you and keeps you and who has an eternal plan of great glory for you. So we really do need to have both painful and pleasant experiences. Both of those come from the hands of a loving God who knows what is best for us, and he does what is best for us. And as we begin to understand that and accept, there's a couple things we can learn. We'll all be able to enjoy all of life, even the painful part of life. And we'll all be able to learn a whole lot more about God, who he is, what he's like, what he wants for us. And then hopefully we can all learn not to repeat those painful parts because we've learned more about God and what he's been trying to teach to us. Let's have prayer together. Father, how we thank you this day for your grace and your plan. At times seems monotonous, at times it seems not monotonous. And at times it very definitely seems unfair, but yet the greatest cruelty was shown toward you. And you willingly took that cross for us so that we could have the peace, the forgiveness, the grace and the mercy, the eternity that our hearts long for, that we could have all of that through Christ in our own lives. Thank you for the wisdom of people like King Solomon who have experienced it all and done it all, lived through it all, and came to the right conclusion. There's plenty of examples who don't do that, but he came to the right conclusions and understanding that life is all about God. It's all about Christ, who is ruler and king and savior. And help us to come to those same conclusions in our hearts and to live with trust more and more every day for you. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for loving us. We just come to place our hearts and lives in your hands, to be used of you, to bring glory to your name. In Christ's pray, amen.